All right, in case you didn't hear, we're on.
Yep.
So welcome to the winter seminar. So my name is Miguel Filloso, I'm professor in civil engineering, and with my colleague Jenny Liu from urban planning. And I'm sorry, I have a cold. So, so we're going to be, managing the seminar. So in general, if you are a civil engineering student, you should come to me with any questions. If you are urban planning student, you should go to Jenny. So this term, there are some things that are different. So if you took a seminar before, just notice that everybody, regardless if you ask a question during the seminar or not, you have to submit using D2L your question the same day of the seminar. Yeah. So that's different. So please keep that in mind. Yeah. So I would also recommend that you read the syllabus because we have made some changes. And the other thing that is kind of important is we do require now that if you're going to come here to watch it live, please arrive by 11:55. So we have no interruptions in terms of people trying to find the series and interrupting the seminar. Yes. So I would say that in terms of things that you need to do, the syllabus is on, available on D12, and go there for any updates or for anything that you need to know. Yes. And if you have questions, you can email Jenny and myself. Is there anything else?
So the Urban Studies and Planning D2L page has not been set up yet, so that will be coming maybe an hour after the class today. I just haven't set it to active. So you'll be submitting your questions if you are in Urban Studies and Planning to the Urban Studies and Planning D2L page that will appear on your D2L. Was there a question?
No.
It's still the same as before.
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, we need to clarify that it's going to be usually running from noon to 12:45, 14, and 75 for questions. But you should, in the normal day, and before one. Yeah. So the other thing, if you are here, we're going to pass this sign sheet. That's the only thing that is really important. That if you are here, you sign this attendance sheet. Yeah? That's I guess that's the other important thing that you need to know. If you're watching online, there are instructions about how you should do that using the new software. Yeah. So I guess that's not applicable for people here. Any other questions? All right. So then I guess we're going to start, and I'm going to start passing the system sheet. So please make sure it goes all the way to the other side, and if you are not taking the class, just pass it along. Thank you.
All right, so let's get started, and welcome to the first Friday seminar of the year 2018. And we're in an all-new room with an all-new system, so bear with us as we may have technical difficulties going forward. But as Miguel mentioned, my name is Jenny Liu, assistant professor in the Urban Studies and Planning School. And today, what we're going to be talking about is a piece of ongoing research of mine that is kind of trying to explore bicycle accessibility and equity here in Portland, Oregon. And I think it's a pretty exciting piece of research that we're conducting, especially given that we've all just been to TRB, where we've looked at a lot of other research, and I have a lot of new interesting ideas that I'm thinking of applying to this particular research as well. But just know that it is currently ongoing, and it is sponsored by NITSE, the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, and is kind of a project that is in collaboration with the Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. So let's get started. So how we got started with the project was here in Portland, we have the 2035 comprehensive plan that was just adopted last year that you can find online as a pretty comprehensive document about what our visions for the city are for 2035. And one of those components of that particular comprehensive plan is this concept called the Portland City Greenways. And this Greenway idea is this really upgraded network of park-like pedestrian and bicycle-friendly streets. So these are going to be very safe, accessible, attractive streets and trails that kind of connect throughout the city, providing kind of a network of bicycle trails for everyone to either commute or use for their recreational purposes. And the idea here is to really connect a lot of the existing trails and a lot of the existing paths to create this more comprehensive network that doesn't have short gaps here and there where you have to kind of revert back onto normal streets for your bicycle travel. So the idea that they had was to have these this network throughout the city at roughly 3-mile intervals at the widest place in the city, but it's going to be a network. So the idea looks kind of like this. So this is also from the comp plan, and they're talking here about the types of trails and urban habitat corridors, parkways, greenways, enhanced greenways, neighborhood greenways. All of those will be incorporated into this particular concept. And this map on here is a very conceptual idea of what that would look like. So, so for our research project, we worked with BPS in trying to figure out, going from this particular conceptual plan, how do we come up with a more solid but not exactly defined routing of the network that could allow us to perform some analysis on this particular kind of concept. So, so this is what we came up with. So on here you see kind of the map of Portland, and on here the blue lines represent the baseline bike facilities. So existing bike facilities that are included in here that existed in 2016. So these include what we've coined as advanced bike facilities. So these are going to be your separated bike lanes, cycle tracks, buffered bike lanes, bike boulevards, and some of our off-street regional multi-use paths. And then the green lines on here are then what we transformed from that conceptual idea of connecting all of these existing pathways to a more complete city urban greenways network. And you can kind of see that on there. And so that combination of the green and blue lines constitutes what we think of as this conceptual network of bike pathways throughout the city. And so the research questions that we had for this particular concept was, first, how can we characterize and measure this urban greenway network? So a lot of times when we're thinking about this, we want to think about it as from a higher level, broader perspective and think about it in a more network fashion. Instead of just looking at how close you are to a certain piece of infrastructure, we're wanting to think about this in a more holistic fashion. So, so that was our first task to how do we measure this exactly. And then we wanted to also really emphasize the equity component in this particular concept and think about going from how we characterize the accessibility of this network, how do we then look at, once we implement this conceptual greenway network in 2035, how does that change accessibility for different geographic regions of the city, but also for various different population groups in the city, paying particular attention to those communities that are most disadvantaged in the picture. So kind of that is the motivation for what we kind of embarked on doing for this particular project. So, so when we started thinking about this, we started exploring a lot of what people have been doing in terms of characterizing bicycle network accessibility. Obviously, a lot of this comes from accessibility of other types of transportation networks that have been a lot more developed than in the bicycle realm. And the Federal Highway Administration in 2016 actually published something that defines active transportation networks in a very specific way. And that it has to be, consist of a series of interconnected facilities that allow non-motorized road users of all ages and abilities to safely and conveniently get where they needed to go. So, so we kind of started from that idea, but obviously operationalizing that idea involves a lot of data of all different kinds. And they also kind of pointed out from that particular larger concept, what are the 6 principles that you should include in this kind of network accessibility measure of a bicycle network? And they wanted to include things like cohesion, directness, accessibility on a kind of for all abilities kind of accessibility, alternatives, safety, security, and comfort. So as much as possible, we were trying to incorporate this, but we were also mindful of the fact that oftentimes you don't have enough data to actually incorporate all of these. So we started developing accessibility measures of the bicycle network from a very, very basic level, going from the simplest specification, and then we started complicating things as we go along. So I'll be introducing, I think, 2 of our measures that were the most simplistic, and we're still working on kind of the 3rd and 4th measures that incorporates a few more of the principles that are listed on here. But this was something that we were constantly keeping in mind as we were developing and figuring out what we were going to do with our urban greenways network. Okay, so back to our first question. How do we characterize accessibility for the urban greenway network? So the different levels of accessibility measures that we developed for this particular project kind of went from the very basic, from the distance-based to a destination-based framework, and then all the way down to a low-stress network-based framework. So going from the simplest one on top, the distance-based measurement framework, and we actually coined an acronym, although I haven't decided if I'm going to keep that acronym, because it is called the UGM, which is the Urban Greenway Network Measurement acronym, but it sounds a little bit too close to UGB for my liking, so I'm probably going to think of something else. But for now, we're going to use UGMs as our shorthand for what these frameworks look like. So the most simple UGM on a distance base is really based on the idea that how close you are to any kind of greenway network infrastructure, the better off you are, the better you're able to access. So that is pretty much based on the idea from the FHWA directness principle. So then we moved on from there to a destination-based kind of UGM, and this is based on the idea that a network is there to allow you to reach different kinds of destinations that you need to go to, be it jobs or shopping or recreational opportunities and so forth. So, so that particular measure is also kind of a directness measure, but it kind of incorporates the desirability or the attractiveness of different destinations and how they can be reached by this particular kind of bike network. And then finally, we are still working on the low stress network based framework for our UGM. So this incorporates into the measurement a little bit more information about the particular infrastructure that you have to use as a cyclist. So, so things like how much slope is there on that road, how much traffic is used, how much motorized traffic is on that route. All of those, how many turns will you have to make, what kind of intersection you'll encounter when you're making those turns. Those are the things that contribute to stress and also contribute to how people are going to be using that particular network. So, so it's definitely a much more data intensive kind of measure, but it also incorporates a lot of how our behavior is impacted by the infrastructure. So kind of different levels, all kind of having different data requirements and computational intensities. So, so let me take you through the distance-based and destination-based measures that we came up with. So here's a stylized example of our distance-based UGM. So the stylized picture that you have on here, we're going to use that orange block group as an example, and all of those small squares that you see on there are going to be the individual blocks that are within that block group. So, so in this example, we have two bike lanes that are kind of parallel on my picture here. This is very stylized. And for each of those blocks that are illustrated in this particular graph, we figure out for each block, how far are they from their nearest bike facility. So for the most part, for most of the blocks kind of up on the top part of that block group, their nearest bike facility is that top bike lane. So that's how we calculate their closest distance to their nearest bike facility. And then the kind of bottom 2 rows, I think, of, I guess maybe 1 row of blocks, their nearest facility is this lower bike lane that's on here. So, so we then calculate that for all of the blocks in the city, and we use that at the census block level. And all of these distances are based on network travel distances, so it's not a straight line distance like you see on my very stylized diagram here. It's actually a little bit more curvy than what you see on here, but I thought this would be good for just general understanding. And then all of this is also aggregated to a census block group level for the equity analysis, which I'll talk a little bit more on towards the end of my presentation. So as you can see, the distance-based measure really only measures how close you are to get to the nearest facility, and then you can kind of start traveling on your bike from there. And it's the least data intensive. So here's what we found based on the bike facilities that are currently in existence, and then also with the 2035 comp plan. So on the left here is the current situation. So you'll see on here all of the blocks that are close to the existing bike trails, bike lanes. Those are the ones that are more green. And then as you go further out, especially in the farther east side of Portland, and also in the deep southeast zones of Portland, those very orange areas are going to be the areas where you see the least amount of access according to the DistanceBased UGM, which is obvious because they don't have bike lanes or advanced bike facilities, sorry. But when you move from the current scenario to the 2035 concept that we have here, according to this DistanceBased UGM, you start seeing that this bike network is expanding out and providing a lot more access, at least proximity-wise, to a large swath of the eastern Portland, as well as in deep southeast Portland. And this is straightforward and obvious because the idea of the city Greenways concept in the 2035 comp plan is to create access to a broader swath of people. So while this is simplistic, it still tells us a good amount of information. So now, aside from being close to a bike facility that you can access, we wanted to look at a distance-based UGM. So this distance-based UGM is a gravity-based opportunities measure. So this is the idea that accessibility is defined as access to relevant destinations and opportunities, right? If we're only talking about riding on a bike lane kind of as recreation, just you're riding around, then this doesn't matter quite as much. But when you're talking about using the bike network as a way to actually commute or actually to get to places where you need to go, then this is an important measure. So, so we based our destinations on several identified trip generator destinations that we found in literature, and came up with 4 broader categories. So these 4 are employment, shopping, services, and recreation. And obviously we can come up with tons more categorizations if we wanted to, but we wanted to kind of keep it relatively simple to illustrate this particular concept for the City Greenways project. So typically when you have this kind of destination-based accessibility measure, it's also usually weighted by either number of jobs, retail sales volume, building square footage, kind of to identify that in locations where you have lots and lots of jobs concentrated, it's likely to be a much more attractive destination where more people are going to be going. Or if you have a location with very high retail sales, then that means that it's a popular shopping destination. So that's pretty straightforward, and we did do some weighting that I'll show you in a bit. So, so the way that we found our destinations for employment, shopping, and services, what we used is the LEHD data set, and we used the most recent year, 2014. That's the longitudinal employer and household dynamics data set that you can obtain pretty easily. And so we identify where are the employment, shopping, and services hotspots throughout the city. Let's see. So for recreation, on the other hand, because recreation, well, recreation as we're defining here, we're more talking about outdoors recreation, kind of to put in a slight bit of distinction with the services and shopping kind of destination. So we mostly looked at parks for this recreation destination. So we used the RList data set to figure out where parks are and how big the parks are to kind of figure out, well, maybe larger parks are usually a little bit more desirable, more activities involved in those particular locations. And so we used NAICS industrial categorizations to figure out where the different types of jobs are concentrated. So these industrial industry categorization codes tells us, for example, which jobs are in the retail sector, and those would fall into the shopping category. And for services, we're looking at industrial categorizations that involve things like finance, where you'd go for banking purposes, insurance places where you might go to figure out your insurance, or places where you might have arts and entertainment types of establishments. Those are kind of services in general. It's pretty broad encompassing, but it definitely does represent a good sector of where we might want to go as a destination. Okay, so moving on. All right, so once we defined that, we took a look at all of the census blocks in Portland and identified where do we see the most job density. So, so we didn't just look at the raw numbers for each census block. We also looked at what is the area for each square block, each census block, and we calculated what is the job density. And then we went about and identified just the top 15 percentile of all of these different various kinds of employment in census blocks in Portland. So like here in the top left, you'll see that all of the orangey blocks are where all of the employment centers are around the city. You can see that a lot of it is concentrated in the central business district and also close in south east side, and then kind of scattered throughout. And then another maybe concentration up there in the airport industrial area, kind of scattered throughout. Slightly different patterns for each of these different types of destinations that you'll see here. So for example, services and shopping are a little bit more well dispersed than just general employment opportunities, just because we're seeing a lot more of job hotspot concentration in these smaller sectors that are kind of throughout the neighborhoods in Portland. And then recreation, it's pretty obvious that those are where the main parks are concentrated here in Portland. Okay, so once we defined where the destinations are, then our urban greenways measure, our UGM, is to then measure which of these destinations are easily accessible using the bike network, either before and also after with the 2035 concept. And so here's what we came up with is we defined a bike catchment area. So I think we defined around a quarter mile, being a quarter mile close to any bike facility. And so if you looked at this employment map here, it's a little bit harder to see on a presentation, but all of the kind of orange, yellow spots on there, those are going to be employment centers, but kind of the medium orange ones are the bikeable or easily accessible via bike employment centers in 2016. And then the darkest color ones are the additional employment centers you'll be able to easily access via the bike network in 2035. So can't see very well, but there's a sprinkling of those kind of spread out through the southeast here, and then also in the outer east side that are a little bit more obvious than the ones that are in the central business district. So employment-wise, it's improving access to employment, but then if you looked at retail, you see a lot more dispersion of access to shopping destinations around the city, and a lot of them are kind of just dispersed throughout the census blocks, a lot of them in the east side, southeast, in areas where we did not have good accessibility before. Right, and then these maps show service centers and park and recreation centers, kind of the same idea that areas that didn't have good access to bike lanes before now have destinations that are much more easily accessible via our urban greenway network. And then we've decided that aside from this kind of visual representation of centers, we kind of summarized all of this into exactly how many of these are easily accessible via bike network. And this is the summary. So if you take your attention to the top part of this particular graph table, you'll see that we identified the percentage of important destinations that are reachable or easily reachable via the urban greenway network. And you can see that there are significant increases in the percentage that you can reach. For example, for employment centers, you go from 62% that are easily reached to about 87%. And then kind of same pattern throughout parks and recreational areas, you're also seeing a good amount of increase. But then, as I mentioned before, these destinations are not weighted. So this first top part here is not weighted. We count each employment center as pretty much equal. It doesn't matter if one has, say, 15 jobs versus 100 jobs, as long as they're in the top 15 percentile of the city's employment centers. So we thought that that was not exactly accurate in terms of figuring out whether people can reach important destinations. That important destinations, by definition, means that more people want to or need to reach them, right? So, so then we went about and weighted all of these destinations by the number of jobs that are in those particular centers to really pull out that idea of desirability in these destinations. And you can see that for employment centers, retail, and service, a lot of the percentage of destinations that can be reached as weighted by number of jobs, there is still a significant increase from the before scenario, but those increases are slightly not quite as high as the unweighted scenario. But so what this means is that a lot of times when we look at the network of the proposed 2035 plan, it may be that a lot of the newer bike lanes in that network are not proposed next to high density or higher density employment centers, but kind of to more dispersed employment centers, meaning that it gives people access to kind of a wider variety of different destinations, but not necessarily increases access to the most dense employment centers. And also because closest to the most dense employment centers, we already have access to a lot of these bike facilities already. And thus there's not that big of a change, especially when we weight them. And the same thing goes, well, actually, the only one that is different is when you're looking at parks. So when we are weighting parks, we actually weigh them by the size of the park. So we actually categorize them into 3 different sizes and weighted them accordingly. And if you looked at the weighted percentage of park destinations that you can reach, you actually see a higher number than the unweighted scenario, which means that the new urban greenway network gives you more access to larger parks that offer a greater variety of activities. Okay, so that kind of concludes my explanation of what we did with the accessibility part of this bike research, and we're continuing on that, which I'll talk about in a few. So now we're going to move on to talking about, well, if we have these accessibility measures, we've already seen kind of spatially how the urban greenway network is going to be distributed geographically throughout the city, and we can make maybe some guesses about who they're going to reach most, but it's still important to kind of go through the analysis and figure out what are the equity implications, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so for the equity analysis, it was a little bit more difficult because we had to, a lot of the demographic details about who lives where is not super accurate at a very small geographic detail level. So what we had to do was to move from a census block level to a census block group level to at least get some level of accuracy in terms of the demographics and the population that are living in these areas. So, so first, before we move on to the equity analysis, is to see what these maps become, or what the accessibility measures look like when we kind of aggregate them to a census block group level. So this is the distance-based UGM, the before on the left and the after on the right. And for this particular measure, it's the lighter color, the better. So the lighter color indicates the fact that you're closer to a bike facility. And you can see that, in the current situation, most of this part, kind of more close in Portland, has pretty good access to bike lanes, but then again, lots of lacking areas in the southeast and the further east side. And then you see kind of that lightening of the colors on the 2035. So you can see that this indicates that, but it's very much a lot coarser than we hope it could be. But anyway, so for the distance-based UGM, the same thing, the same general idea is here we have really good access to destinations in the middle of the city, but that improves as we move on to the right-hand side where the darker colors indicates better accessibility according to our destination-based UGM. Okay, so how do we go about doing this equity analysis? We decided that, aside from looking at the spatial distribution of things, that we would take some of the work that has already been done in the Portland Metro to kind of help us guide our direction. So in the 2018 to 2021 Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Plan, they actually define pretty clearly what they define as historically marginalized communities. And so we decided that we would use that definition as kind of our baseline for looking at whether these historically marginalized communities were helped a lot by the urban greenway network or not. So the criteria, they have 5 different criteria for what constitutes a historically marginalized community. And they actually define this at an even bigger level. So this is all defined at a census tract level, which if you're familiar with census geography is quite a large area of land. So we actually use their definition, but we obtain data so that we can actually do this at a census block group level to just provide us with a little bit more detail, because census tracts are just so huge that it really dilutes a lot of the information. So, so our 5 criteria are people of color, low income, limited English proficiency, older adults, and young persons. And the way that it is defined in the Metro tip is by, for example, for people of color, they define a census tract to be a historically marginalized community if in the census tract they have a percentage of people of color that is above the regional average. So the regional average is 22.4%. So as long as you're above that percentage, then that census tract becomes a tier 1 historically marginalized community. So the same thing for low income and all of the criteria. They also define a tier 2 criteria that also includes not only would you have to be above the regional average, but you also it also is a census tract where population density is higher. So that's for the first 3 criteria there. So we actually didn't only use their criteria for defining historically marginalized communities. We decided to just take all 5 of these different variables that describe demographics, and we decided to actually just look at all of the data and not just look at geographies and whether they're in or out of this marginalized communities definition. So we did a little bit more comprehensive look at these demographic variables. So to give you an idea of where these population demographics are distributed, these are the 5 criteria distributed around Portland, and the darker the area is, the higher percentage of that particular demographic group is. And you can see that for most of these, you see kind of it's a good spread throughout the city's geography, but a lot of times the non-white population, the low-income population has some concentration in the downtown area, but they are oftentimes high concentrations kind of at the edges of the city, where also we have very low levels of accessibility in the bike infrastructure and other types of infrastructure as well. So, so this is just kind of giving you an idea of where people are located. So what I mean by us looking at this from a more comprehensive perspective is that we actually did this with kind of a quintile analysis. So the way to read this is, for example, in this top left-hand graph here, we're looking at non-white population, and we divide it up into census block groups with falling within each quintile. So 0 to 20%, so the lowest 20% of census block groups with the lowest amount of non-white population, all the way going up to the highest quintile, the ones that have the most concentrated populations of non-white residents. So the way to look at this is the lighter yellowish green bar represents on here the distance-based UGM, how close you are to the nearest bike facility for that particular quintile of the population. So, so on here, if you see that light green bar going down to a smaller green bar, that means that your distance to the nearest bike facility has dropped with the 2035 urban greenways network concept. So that means you are closer. You can access it more easily. And across the board, for all 5 criteria, you'll see that, well, now there are more bike lanes, more of the network if it's being built. Everyone has closer access. That's pretty obvious, right? But what we also wanted to see is that, are these improvements to the network concentrated? So we didn't want to look at everyone as an aggregate, or whether you're a high non-white population census block group as a definition. We wanted to kind of look at the distribution across the board. And what we would want to see, or what I would want to see, is that the census block groups that fall into the highest quintile of each of these disadvantaged populations have the most improvement in their accessibility to the bike network. And that's what these lines represent, is that if we have a line that's kind of slanted upwards like that, then that means that the improvements are most concentrated or most pronounced for those groups, the quintile of census block groups that are that have the most, say, limited English proficiency population. If we had a bar that is relatively flat, that means this benefit or improvement is kind of evenly distributed across all quintiles of that particular population. So, so looking at this particular distance-based UGM, for the most part, we see that for the non-white population, low-income households, and limited English proficiency populations, we see a higher improvement for those who are, or for those block groups that have the most number of these disadvantaged populations. It's a less obvious trend for the older adults and the young persons categories. So this is for the distance-based UGMs, but we also wanted to apply the same type of analysis to the destination-based UGM to see, do these different populations, these historically marginalized communities, do they also have better access to destinations as well? So that's what this next analysis looks like. So it's slightly different, and you'll see that for this measure, this destinations-based UGM, the higher number you have, the better. So you see across the board that there is an improvement with the new network being put into place for everyone, but the effects are quite different depending on what group you're in. And the results are that for the non-white population and for the low-income households, in this quintile analysis, you see the improvement kind of being flat across all quintiles, which indicates to me that the improvement to destinations for across the different census block groups in these two categories is not so much concentrated in the most disadvantaged communities, but rather kind of spread pretty evenly. And whether or not that's something that we want to maybe think about improving upon, or maybe concentrating some of more of our efforts in the higher quintiles here, that might be something to consider for planners that are putting this into implementation. The only one that we see a very high percentage of improvement is this last quintile that is here for limited English proficiency, which is probably the only standout in this particular analysis here. Okay, so this is just one piece of our equity analysis. There are actually different pieces that involve a lot more numbers that I thought wouldn't be so visually appealing. So that is more results to come, hopefully, in my next transportation seminar presentation, or you can just stop me in the hallway and ask me about it. So in conclusion, is that what we found was that bike accessibility measures are really important to incorporate not only just your distance or ability to access your nearest facility, but it's really important to incorporate things like destinations and opportunities, because that is what people are using these bike networks for. And that when we're thinking about these equity analysis, that a quintile analysis might be so different types of equity analysis are important to give us a kind of a complementary, more wholesome picture of where the benefits or improvements are actually concentrated in terms of accessibility. So one big limitation and caveat that I think will be part of potential future work is that this is really a static analysis. So what I'm assuming is that all of these different census block groups across the city still have the same demographics in 2035, which is not a super realistic kind of assumption. So I think what could be incorporated here is that as we're building in these bike networks, as the city is growing and developing economically, are there going to be different shifts and displacements of different groups of people such that we have a different demographic distribution across the city? And if we have a good idea for what that might look like in the future, then we can apply the same kind of equity analysis using that much more accurate projection for where people are going to be in the future. So that's definitely an area that I'm aware of and want to work more on, but that's not part of this particular analysis. So going forward, we're continuing to work on this particular project. I forgot to mention my student, Wei Shi, who is also a big player in this particular project and wouldn't work without her. So we're working on continuing to incorporate more complex variables into our accessibility measure, which I mentioned before, incorporating that low stress network concept into that calculation. And we also have a fourth measure that not only incorporates a low stress network concept, but combines that concept with the destinations that you have to reach. So not only do you consider the infrastructure that provides you with comfort and safety as you're riding on the bicycle network, but also as you're choosing your route and figuring out which destinations am I going to go to for my shopping or my services, we consider both of those things at the same time. So that's forthcoming. And then actually one of the big pieces of this particular project that I have not presented today is to think about these various bicycle accessibility measures, which one of them may be the most appealing or appropriate to link up with economic development outcomes. So which of these explain best where do we see more economic development? How can we link these things up together, which is not something that people often have studied. So that's one of the last research questions that we're hoping to kind of link up these different measurements with economic development variables. So with that, that is the end. Thank you. Right. So I'm open for questions if you have any. Yeah.
I was wondering why parks were weighted by size instead of usage or popularity, I guess.
It was just kind of a data limitation at this point. I didn't have access to kind of park attendance data. So obviously, if I knew how many people access a park per acre, that would be probably a better measure of how desirable a park is. Yeah.
Okay.
Back there?
You mentioned that you incorporate how the demographics are going to see. So you do really incorporate, for example, business growth for the future, or job offers for all the student
No, so this is a completely static analysis, and that's a very good point that a lot of the employment opportunities are going to shift over time. There is going to be growth in some places and maybe like a deterioration in other places. So yes, that would be a great kind of dynamic piece to incorporate as well in the future, especially as I'm doing more of the destination-based I think that, if we go back, so you're talking about this bottom graph here. And I think it's because that the census block groups that were in this highest quintile, so the block groups that had the most people that had limited English proficiency, they started from a very, very low level of accessibility to destination. See how small this bar is compared to like everything else on this graph or these graphs, right? So because they started from such a low level, their improvements, even though this bar is still pretty small, that's why you see that huge jump in terms of the percentage of improvement. But it's still, this is one of the groups, or the group of census block groups that experience the least amount of accessibility. Even though it's a big improvement, it can probably even improve more. Yeah.
So I'm a little curious as to why you showed older adults as part of the marginalized community. Do you really see them bicycling more than middle-aged adults?
Well, it is true that older adults don't necessarily currently bike quite a lot. I didn't personally, so I went by what Portland Metro decided as the historically marginalized communities as kind of my baseline to give a more comprehensive picture instead of me as a researcher just cherry picking which categories I thought were important. I kind of went off by what Portland Metro thought were historically marginalized communities in their transportation plan. And the idea that older adults aren't bicycling quite as much may be true, but there may be room for improvement in how they get access to the bike facility. And maybe that it's just not comfortable enough for them. And this is a way for us to think about that as well.
Yeah. From this research, like running all the numbers, would your end results change the design plan for 2035, or is it more of a analysis of the plan just so we know what's improved based on the plan? Like,
I would hope that it would potentially change some of the routing and the level of the facility that's involved, because at this stage, it's not, we're not close to actually developing the actual implementation plan. So it's been kind of a design and conceptual exercise at this point for us to come up with this analysis to help inform them as they're moving into closer into the stages of implementation. So hopefully they will take this information into consideration. Up here?
So I know there wasn't a lot of planned improvements for kind of the downtown area, but there was a high concentration of like destinations. Just because you want to make like high equity impact, or it's just difficult to make improvements downtown?
Well, in the downtown area, we actually have a good amount of bike networks already. So the connectivity, the access to the bike network is already pretty complete. There are fewer gaps in the downtown area than you would find, like, say, in the more outer sides of Portland. So I think this plan, the idea is to kind of try to connect those gaps, and there's a lot more of that to be done kind of on the outer sides of Portland. Yeah.
So in terms of, particularly in the kind of quintile distribution and the equity impacts, while many of them have a kind of upward trend where the higher quintiles get percentage-wise better impacts, they all still are pretty much across the board much more lacking in the actual number of things that they can access.
Right.
Did you guys consider basically like demonstrating the delta in a different way that would kind of impact, or that would kind of illustrate that more clearly? I mean, basically looking at a delta of percentage change looks positive.
Right.
And while any change for the better is positive, are we actually achieving equity if we're still looking at things where, great, that quintile increased by 150%, but it still doesn't even access 1,000 jobs?
Right. Yeah, I think that, you know, the percentage change does kind of elude that particular point that you're talking about. But I think a lot of these bars, when you're looking at them, you ideally want them to be at least kind of equal across the board. And I think this kind of analysis gives you a preliminary idea of that specifically. And I think that more work has to be done on this front, especially concentrating maybe on, say, like the top 2 quintiles specifically instead of just looking at across the board, because that may not be totally helpful. So yeah, you're right. We need to look at not just percentage change, but the actual levels of improvement.
I was just wondering how much of this project is involving the Southwest area. How much of it?
You mean how many lanes or how many bike facilities are
I
going
just
to go
remember
into?
looking at the map and it seemed like only a small portion of it.
Let's see. Let's go back. The Southwest does not have a lot, but it does have kind of some connections to the existing trails that are going on. And I think it's a lot of this idea of where, so don't take the lanes or the routes that are placed on here as definitive. It's kind of an exercise in thinking through this question, but a lot of what's happening in the Southwest, why it's not there, is because the current infrastructure and the way that the hills are in that particular area is not, doesn't suscept itself very well to this kind of network kind of idea. And that's why there are fewer lanes in that particular area.
Kind of as a follow-up question, I was wondering if there was any collaboration with Southwest Trails.
Not on my project side, but I'm sure that it is something that BPS is talking to the various different areas and the people who are kind of stakeholders in the trails in those areas. Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up with the question you just asked me that you don't have a lot of reporting for the downtown area, because you said there are fewer gaps, but isn't it like on the east side, like the traffic is so much more than having a gap there is not a problem. While in downtown, having a gap like this, like two blocks long, it's extremely dangerous because there's so much more traffic there. That's why, like, even if you got this like 1 block long, it can be really dangerous. So if you have those smaller gaps in downtown, actually improves the safety of hiking a whole lot.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think that when we are actually calculating the low stress network, then that will actually pop up a lot more, because then that the high traffic volume is going to be become a very big factor in showing up like what are the gaps in terms of accessibility in the downtown area. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So thank you, Jenny, for the presentation. You mentioned a couple of times that there were data limitations. So maybe if you have a wish list, then you could get 1 or 2 data fields in addition to what you have. What would that be? And also, you know, in the future, if the city wants to do this, you know, better analysis, what kind of data they should be collecting to improve this type of analysis?
Well, if I had my wish list, I think there would be 2 areas. So one area of data which would be kind of in the infrastructure, transportation related realm. If I had, I know that Portland already has some of the best bike counts in the country or maybe in the world, but we still don't have the same kind of traffic volume data throughout the day that we have for other types of transportation modes. So I feel like if I had that kind of data for the transportation network, that would be hugely helpful. On my other wish list item, I think would have to do with the equity side of the analysis, just the fact that we don't have detailed information about where exactly different groups of people are living on a very fine geographic scale really prevents me from doing the detailed kind of analysis that I do on the accessibility when I have to aggregate everything into a block group, which can encompass maybe a high concentration of non-white population in one corner of it, but it doesn't really apply to the entire block group. So I think that kind of additional data can really help us look at the details of where we want to place these facilities and how we connect the facilities to the people that may need the most access to them. Yeah. All right, so we're at 12:54, so I think that this is probably a good time to end the seminar. So make sure that if you're enrolled in the class to look through the syllabus in detail, especially noting any changes that might occur. And please shoot us an email if you have any questions, and look forward to our next presentation of student presentations from the TRB conference next week. We will have 1 student from civil engineering, 1 student from urban studies and planning, and I think it'll be very exciting. All right, thank you.
I need the sign-up sheet, please. All right. Has everybody signed?